The cold hit him first. Darren opened his eyes and saw the black beams of a stranger's ceiling above him. Gray light seeped through the cracks between the boards. His body ached as if the whole village had beaten him the day before. He sat up on the hard cot and stared at his hands. They were young hands, slender wrists, calluses from a shovel, not a pencil. Someone else's hands. Fragments of someone else's memory surfaced in his mind. His name is Darren. He's 19. 3 days ago, he was thrown out beyond the walls of the Harlan shelter because of his father's debts. An empty mark on his wrist meant he had no gift and nothing with which to pay. They left him his grandfather's hut 300 paces from the gate and wished him well enough to live until spring. Darren stood up and walked around the single room. A hearth made of rough stone, a table, a chest with a handful of hardtack, an axe with a jagged blade. He mechanically tapped the support post with his knuckles and listened to the sound. The post responded with a dull, even thud. The wood was sound. He caught himself doing this and froze. An old habit from another life had surfaced on its own. There, too, he had always begun any inspection with the load-bearing structures. He pushed the thought aside and stepped outside. The hut stood on a gentle slope. Below, the wall of the log and clay shelter loomed darkly. Behind him, a sparse forest began. Darren walked around the house in a circle and stopped after 4 steps. Beneath a layer of moss, carvings were visible on the foundation stone. A spiral of fine notches led underground. He cleared away 2 more stones. The carvings ran along the entire perimeter. His grandfather had known something about this house. The stranger's memory remained silent. Around noon, a bell rang at the shelter's gate. 3 short strikes and 1 long one. Darren didn't understand, but his body understood before he did. His legs tensed on their own. In 4 days, the blood moon would rise. Once every 7 days, the moon turns red and hordes emerge from the forest. The refuge locks its gates and prays. Those outside are not allowed in. Such is the law of Harlan. Darren stood on the hill and looked at the wall that had betrayed him. Then he turned and looked at his hut. The fear was cold and clammy, but beneath the fear, something else was stirring. He crouched by the foundation and ran his finger over the carvings once more. In that life, he had seen thousands of blueprints. This spiral was not a decoration. The spacing of the notches was too uniform. The depth was too precise. They don't carve like that for beauty. They carve like that for function. He had been preparing for 4 days. He didn't know what he was preparing for, so he prepared for everything. He dug a trench 2/3 of his height along the northern slope, where the ascent was most favorable for an attack. He drove stakes into the bottom and singed their tips in the hearth. He blocked the eastern path with a felled pine tree so that the trunk lay at knee height. A running creature would stumble. A falling creature would impale itself on the branches. He calculated this without paper. The numbers fell into place in his head just as they once had during his military service. He remembered this only for a moment. Back then, he had designed structures meant to withstand an impact. Here, he was building something meant to kill. The difference turned out to be smaller than he'd thought. On the 4th evening, the sky darkened earlier than usual. The moon emerged from behind the ridge, swollen and red as a fresh wound. A stench of rot wafted from the forest. Darren stoked the fire, barred the door with a log, and stood by the window with an axe. The first howl rolled through the forest an hour later. Then he heard them. The pounding of countless paws passed by the hill, heading down toward the shelter. The horde was flowing toward the great walls, toward the strong scent of humans. His hut was too small a prey for almost everyone. The creature burst out of the bushes on the northern slope. Gray fur, twisted joints, a snout like melted wax. The ghoul ran toward the scent of a human along the easiest ascent and crashed into the moat. A shriek pierced his ears. Then the screech cut off. Darren stood at the loophole, listening to the young stranger's heart pounding. A second ghoul came, drawn by the first's screech. This one was more cautious. It skirted the edge of the ditch and climbed over via the eastern path. A pine trunk met it head-on. A crunch, a commotion. Darren stepped outside before he could talk himself out of it. The creature was hanging from the branches, struggling. He struck twice with the axe. His hands were shaking. The blows landed precisely. His body remembered working with wood, and the strike came out like a carpenter's, even. He didn't need a third blow. And then the house came to life. The carvings on the foundation flared with a dim red light. Threads of the same light stretched out from the dead creature. The carcass sank like a burnt-out log. Its muscles melted away. Its bones turned white and crumbled to dust. The threads were drawn into the foundation stones. A second glow rose from the moat. The house had absorbed the first creature directly through the earth. Darren stood there, holding his breath. Knowledge arose in his mind without words, solid, clear, alien, and yet immediately his own. The house absorbs the power of creatures that have perished within a radius of 100 steps. The house hoards this power. The house is growing. Right now, there are 2 sparks in the house. 10 are needed for the first reinforcement. The knowledge faded, but the red light remained. It flowed along the carvings in slow, pulsing bursts, like a pulse. Darren sank to the threshold because his legs could no longer hold him. He laughed quietly and maliciously. Everyone hides from the blood moon behind walls, but his walls feed on it. Before dawn, he killed another ghoul. The creature lunged at the red glow of the foundation like a moth to a flame and was impaled through the belly at the bottom of the moat. The house drank her in, too. 3 sparks. In the morning, the moon paled, and the horde retreated into the forest just as suddenly as it had come. Darren went out to survey the damage. The moat had held, the pine tree had cracked but remained standing. At the far edge of the moat lay a pile of white bone dust. He was raking it up with a shovel when he heard footsteps. A man emerged from the shelter with a bow slung across his back, broad-shouldered, bearded. Darren recognized him from a foreign memory. Brax, Harlan's senior hunter. Brax walked up to the ditch and stopped. He looked at the stakes, at the bone dust, at the bones, stripped of every last scrap of flesh. His face turned to stone. He asked how the boy had survived the night out there. Darren replied that he'd been digging and had been lucky. Brax picked up a pinch of bone dust, rubbed it between his fingers, and sniffed it. He said that in 40 years, he'd seen many gnawed bones. He said that no one gnaws bones like that. Not a beast, not fire, not time. He said it quietly, and that quietness sent a chill down Darren's spine. Brax turned and walked down toward the gate. He never once looked back. Darren watched him go and realized one simple thing: he'd survived the night. Now he had to survive the people who would start asking questions. In the shelter, they had a single word for fleshless bone dust: filth. They didn't banish the filth beyond the wall. They burned the filth. Darren had been reborn into the body of a 19-year-old outcast, cast out of the Harlan shelter with his grandfather's hut on the hill and an empty mark without a gift. On the first blood moon, he killed 3 ghouls with traps and an axe, and learned that the house with the carved foundation absorbs the power of creatures that have perished within a radius of 100 steps, and now possesses 3 of the 10 sparks needed for the first reinforcement. Senior Hunter Brax found the fleshless bones, suspected corruption, and returned to the refuge with this knowledge. Darren didn't wait for Brax to return with torches. He went down to the gate himself. The guard at the gate grimaced, but let him through. Outcasts were not forbidden from entering during the day. Outcasts were forbidden from staying overnight. Darren found Brax by the smokehouse and laid 4 ghoul fangs on a log. He said he'd taken them from the creatures killed in the trapping pits. He said he was willing to trade the fangs and claws to the refuge for nails and rope. He said the bones had crumbled because the creatures had died at dawn, and the dawn sun, after a red night, scorched their flesh. The lie was smooth. Darren had heard this tall tale from someone else's memory. The elders of Harlan used to tell it to their children. Brax twirled a fang between his fingers and was silent for a long time. Then he said that a tall tale is a tall tale, and fangs are fangs. In exchange for 4 fangs, he gave a coil of rope and a handful of nails and said he'd keep watch over the hill. Darren nodded and left. He hadn't won an excuse. He'd won 6 days. For 6 days, he turned the hill into a machine. The first section of the work looked like this. Darren, knee-deep in mud, deepened the trench and shaped it into an arc so that the arc would funnel all the creatures running from the north into a single choke point. He estimated the slope by eye and checked it with his palm. Water from yesterday's rain runs along the bottom, exactly where he calculated it would. That means the creatures will run there too. The second section, Darren is on the roof, rearranging the shingles and erecting a canopy of poles over the door at a 40-degree angle. A leaping creature will slide down such a slope straight onto the palisade stakes. He hammers in the last nail and pauses for a second. His fingers set the angle on their own, without a single measurement. In his previous life, he'd installed similar deflectors above fort gates, only made of steel. Third cut. Night. By torchlight, Darren burns a map of the hill onto a small board and divides it into sectors. The throat, the trapping ground, a dead zone by the wall where the beasts will trample under the overhang. He looks at the map and doesn't see a hut with pits. He sees a fortress that doesn't yet exist. Fourth cut. Darren hauls stones from the stream and lays them along the neck to form a low wall 1.5 elbows high. Not for defense, for guidance. A running herd won't jump over an obstacle if there's a clear passage nearby. The herd flows into the passage. A moat awaits in the passage. By evening on the 6th day, his hands were covered in bloody blisters, and the hill was ready. They were watching his work from the shelter. The boys in the gate tower were pointing at him. The guards roared with laughter. The young foreman at the gate laughed the loudest when Darren came to swap the claws for pitch. The foreman asked if the fool was planning to fight the horde with a shovel. He asked if Darren might as well dig himself a deeper grave right away, since he loved digging so much. Darren took the pitch and replied that after the moon rose, the foreman could climb the hill and see for himself. The 7th evening arrived with a crimson glow. The moon rose, red and heavy. Darren took his place at the embrasure. This time he was calmer, and that very calmness made him feel uneasy. The horde set out an hour after sunset. The main stream once again flowed toward the walls of the refuge, but the hill was no longer an empty space. The hill glowed. The faint red pulse of the foundation drew the creatures like the scent of blood. Old Darren counted a dozen shadows that had broken away from the stream. The first 4 ghouls flew into the neck of the hill in a tight cluster and crashed into the moat on top of one another. The stakes took them all. The 5th leaped from a boulder onto the roof, slid along the eaves, and impaled himself on the palisade. The 6th and 7th scrambled over the stone wall, where Darren had left the only opening, and the 7th pinned the 6th down in the wolf pit. The house drank ceaselessly. Red threads stretched out from all sides, and the foundation hummed low like a beehive. Darren finished off the 8th creature with an axe through the loophole as it clawed at the door. The 9th one turned out to be different, larger, an elbow taller than a man, bone plates on its shoulders. It didn't run toward the neck of the house. It stopped at the edge of the hunting ground and stared at the house for a full minute. Then it went around through the forest. Darren lost sight of it, and the next half hour felt like years to him. The creature struck the back wall where there was neither a moat nor stakes. The logs creaked. Darren darted to the rear loophole and struck the paws poking through the gap with his axe. The creature roared and tore the wall toward itself. The top row of logs began to shift, and then the house trembled of its own accord. The red light coalesced into a single surge. Knowledge flashed through his mind. 10 sparks collected. The fortification is accessible. Except now. Darren accepted without hesitation. A pulse ran through the logs like a spasm. The wood beneath his palms darkened, swelled, and became hard as stone. The creature's claws scraped against the wall, leaving no mark. The creature thrashed against the petrified logs until the 3rd cockcrow. Then the red light of the moon began to fade, and it retreated into the forest, carrying its torn paw away. Darren slid down the wall onto the floor and sat there until morning. In the morning, he stepped outside and saw his house anew. The logs had turned gray with red streaks. On the foundation, a new spiral pattern had emerged over the old carvings. The knowledge in his mind had expanded. The house had absorbed 12 sparks overnight. The house offered the following paths. The stone flesh of the walls had already been accepted. Next came the storage cellar for 20 sparks, then the watchful eye for 30. The list was cut off by fog. The fog meant that the house needed more deaths to remember more forms. Darren stood over the list that no one but him could see, feeling both rich and condemned at the same time. By noon, 3 people had climbed the hill: Brax, a young foreman, and a gaunt old man with a staff, in whom a stranger's memory recognized Elder Harlan named Olveg. They walked along the ditch, clogged with white rot, past the palisade with a dried-up carcass, past the back wall where a broken claw, as long as a palm, was lodged in the wood. The corporal was no longer laughing. He touched the petrified log, and his face was that of a man who had been shown a walking corpse. He kept repeating that this couldn't be true. He tapped the wall with the hilt of his knife and listened to the stony sound over and over again. Brax wasn't looking at the walls. Brax was looking at Darren. Elder Olveg remained silent longer than anyone else. Then he said what he had come to say. That night, the horde had barely pressed against Harlan's gates. That night, half as many creatures as usual were scaling the walls, but everyone standing on the watchtowers saw where the extra stream was flowing. It was flowing toward the red light, toward the hill, toward Darren's house. The elder jabbed his staff in the direction of the hut and said that this thing was luring the horde. He said that, for now, it was luring the weak. He asked what would happen when it lured the strong, and the strong wouldn't bother with the pits, but would pass right through the hill, sending the evil and the wounded tumbling toward the refuge. He didn't answer. He said that Harlan's council would decide what to do with the hill and with its owner. The 3 of them went back down. Darren remained standing amid his working traps, his petrified walls, and his first real victory, which was turning into an accusation right before his eyes. The council convened 2 days later in Harlan's longhouse, and Darren was summoned as one is summoned to a trial. He stood in the middle of the hall, on the trampled earthen floor, and listened. Elder Olveg said that the red light on the hill was a lure for the horde. The hearth priest said that bones without flesh were an abomination, and that the abomination must be burned along with the house. The young decurion unexpectedly said something else. He said that with his own hands he had touched walls that no claw could penetrate. He said that in a single night, the hill had ground up a dozen creatures, and not a single one had made it alive to his doorstep. Brax remained silent and watched. Darren waited for a pause, and when it came, he spoke his prepared words. He said he didn't know why his grandfather's house was like that, and that was the plain truth. He said that every creature trapped in its pits was one that hadn't made it to Harlan's walls, and that was also true. He proposed a deal. Every moon, he would draw part of the horde toward himself and hand over half of the fangs, claws, and armor to the refuge. In return, Harlan would leave the hill alone and sell him iron, pitch, and stone at a fair price. The hall buzzed with murmurs. The priest shouted about defilement. Olveg banged his staff on the floor, but for the 3rd year in a row, Harlan had been short on iron for arrows, and here a man was offering to pay for the right to die outside the settlement. The council decided as follows: leave the hill alone until the 3rd moon. If, after the 3rd moon, the horde struck the refuge harder than before, the hill would be burned. Darren left the longhouse with a reprieve instead of a sentence, and with new insight into people. He had not been acquitted. He had been put on the list. Now he needed more than just traps. He needed traps that would ensure no one in this hall would dare open their mouth after the 3rd moon. And for that, he needed money. In Harlan, money was called Ulmer. The merchant Ulmer ran a shop by the eastern wall and bought up everything he could resell to the caravans from the south. Darren came to him with a canvas sack. Ulmer greeted him the way one greets beggars. He spoke through clenched teeth and examined his fingernails. He said that all he could offer the empty-handed man from the hill was a cheap rope to make it easier to hang himself before the moon rose. Darren silently untied the sack and rolled a murky red ball the size of a fist onto the counter, the heart core of a scaly creature. Dom hadn't had time to drink the one that had fled wounded, but her younger sister had been devoured by the wolf pits that night, and this had been found inside her carcass. Someone else's memory knew that southern alchemists paid for such cores by weight in silver. Ulmer knew this even better. In 3 seconds, the merchant's face played out an entire lifetime. Boredom, distrust, greed, fear, greed again. He took the core as carefully as one would hold a baby, weighed it in his palm, and looked at Darren with entirely different eyes, completely different. He asked how many of these Darren could bring in per month. Darren replied that it depended on how much iron, stone, and chains Ulmer could supply him. Thus was born an alliance of greed and need. It doesn't get any stronger than that. For the next 5 days, the hill rumbled and smoked. First cut. Ulmer's creaking cart crawled uphill, loaded with strip iron, while Darren forged the teeth for jaw traps on a homemade anvil, welding on the hardening layer by eye based on the color of the glow. His hands remembered the color. In that life, he took on work from blacksmiths and accepted defective pieces without even glancing at the paperwork. Second scene. Darren marks out a spiral around the entire house, with stakes and sets up man-sized wicker shields, turning the approaches into a labyrinth with a single entrance. Any creature heading toward the light at the foundation must pass through 7 turns of the spiral, and at each turn, iron awaits it. Third cut. At night, by torchlight, Darren pours liquid clay from the stream onto the bottom of the new moat. By morning, the clay has set into a crust. The creature breaks through the crust and gets stuck up to its belly. Fourth stage. The house receives 20 sparks accumulated since the last moon, and the earth beneath the hearth splits open on its own. A staircase leads down to a basement that wasn't there yesterday. The basement walls are made of the same gray stone with red veins. Cold, red lights burn of their own accord in the niches. Darren goes down, stacks the cannonballs and iron there, and stands for a long time looking at the shelves. The house is no longer growing, only upward. The third moon rose like a fire. The horde came thick and fast. Darren later counted the remains and came to 26. The spiral of the labyrinth worked like a mill. The creatures were sucked into the single entrance, jostling at the knees, crushing one another, and dying on the teeth of the traps in the clay slurry of the ditches. The house devoured them without stopping, and the pulse of the foundation beat faster and faster. By midnight, the master of this wave arrived. Darren heard him before he saw him. His stride was so heavy it made the water in the tub tremble. A beast as tall as 2 oxen emerged from the forest. Its shell was humped. Its head was like a battering ram. Small creatures scattered from beneath its feet. The besieging beast did not enter the labyrinth. It walked right through the labyrinth. The woven shield scattered like straw. A trap clanged against its front paw and snapped. Darren stood by the embrasure and counted aloud to keep from howling. He counted the steps and estimated its weight based on the depth of the tracks, 1.5 metric tons. The walls would withstand 1 blow, maybe 2. He remembered how, in that other life, he'd calculated the weight of a battering ram to test the gate and cut the memory short because the beast had reached the clay moat. 1.5 metric tons had crushed through the crust right up to its shoulder blades. The beast roared and thrashed. The clay held. Darren leaped from the roof down a ladder onto the front yard and drove a forged pike prepared for just such a guest. Then he hung from the shaft with all his weight until the carcass stopped twitching. It took the house a quarter of an hour to devour the besieging beast. The red threads were as thick as a rope. When it was all over, knowledge unfolded in his mind, broader than ever before. 40 sparks from a single carcass. The fog in the list of paths cleared. The house revealed new forms, a watchtower, a bone palisade, and separately, at the very bottom of the list, a line burned that made Darren's mouth go dry. A beacon of call. A device on the roof, a light visible 10 fields away. A light that calls the strongest. The rule of knowledge was straightforward. The stronger the slain enemy, the more sparks. The more sparks, the faster the house grows. The beacon is the house's hunger. Darren sat in the new basement amid the projectiles and stared at that line until dawn. In the morning, people from Harlan came to look at the carcass of the siege beast. They came all day. They were silent. They touched the armor. The hearth priest did not say a word about the taint, and at sunset, a woman in leather armor with a baron's insignia on her chest climbed the hill. Captain of the guard, Senta. A foreign memory knew her. The baron's service kept watch over all the shelters in the valley. Senta walked around the labyrinth of the dead carcass, the petrified house. She looked intently and somberly. Then she said she had 2 pieces of news. First, the Council of Harlan would no longer touch the hill, because after this night, they would be afraid to touch it. Second, the hill had been reported to Baron Vaylor. The Baron taxes every fortified property in the valley. The Baron will send a bill, and the Baron really doesn't like it when a fortress he didn't build springs up in his valley. Senta left, and Darren remained standing, caught between 2 fires. Below lay the hideout he had silenced. Ahead of him was the Baron who could not be silenced. And on the roof of the house was an empty space where a beacon could stand. Harlan's council gave Darren a reprieve until the 3rd moon, and he formed an alliance with the merchant Ulmer, trading creature cores for iron, after which he built a spiral maze of traps and a clay moat and opened the house's cellar for 20 sparks. By the 3rd moon, the hill had ground down 26 creatures, and Darren finished off a siege beast stuck in the clay with his pike, yielding 40 sparks and unlocking new forms, including a beacon of call that lured the mightiest. The council backed down, but Senta, captain of the Baron's guard, reported that the fortress had been reported to Baron Vaylor, who had come to collect taxes and would not tolerate foreign fortresses in the valley. The bill from the Baron arrived 3 days later. A scribe in a fox fur cloak unrolled the scroll and read aloud. Any estate fortified with towers, moats, and walls is subject to a tax of 30 silver coins per full moon. Failure to pay means the estate is transferred to the Baron's crown. Darren listened and asked since when a pit with stakes had been considered a tower. The scribe replied that it was not up to him, but to the Baron to decide. Darren paid. The silver from the sale of the cannonballs to Ulmer was still warming the chest, and he counted out 30 coins without batting an eye. The clerk was disappointed. Darren could tell by the look in his eyes. The Baron didn't need the money. The Baron needed an excuse. Whether he paid now or later made no difference. It was merely a matter of timing. And then Darren made the decision that had been brewing since that night in the basement. If the bill was going to come anyway, then by the due date he would be the master not of a hut with pits, but of something that barons speak to politely. The house needed sparks, lots of them and fast, and sparks are produced by the strong. He climbed onto the roof, cleared a space, and took the form of a lighthouse. 40 sparks shot out at once. A bone spire twice as tall as a man grew from the ridge of the roof. At sunset, the spire glowed red from within, and a beam the color of red-hot iron spread across the valley. The light was visible all the way from the horizon. In Harlan that evening, the dogs howled. The next morning, 2 men came to him, and both said the same thing in different words. Ulmer was the first to arrive. The merchant was pale and sweaty. He said he'd seen the light from his window and that the hairs on his arms had stood on end. He said it was one thing to weed out the weak from the fringes of the horde, but quite another to summon those who walk in its depths. He said that a dead partner brings no cores. Senta was the second to arrive. She dismounted at the foot of the hill and climbed up, speaking calmly, her voice more terrifying than a scream. She said she had served in the valley for 11 years. She said that over the years she had seen 2 shelters perish, and both had perished not at the hands of the horde, but because of pride. She said it wasn't too late to take down the beacon and that a stubborn fool is simply a dead man. Darren listened to both of them and gave the same answer to both. The light will remain. Senta looked into his face for a long time. Then she said she would come after the moon to see what would remain of him. and she rode away. For 4 days, Darren prepared the hill for the guests he himself had invited. The first cut. He deepened and widened the old northern moat, turning it into a covered trench with a deck of poles and sod. The deck was precisely calculated. It can support the weight of small creatures, but will break under the weight of large ones. Darren checks his calculations with sacks of stones and rearranges the support poles 3 times. In that other life, he'd done the opposite. There, he'd reinforced the ceiling so they wouldn't collapse. It turned out that knowledge works equally well both ways. Second cut. Using the bones of a siege beast and imported iron, he assembles a frame above the entrance to the labyrinth with a suspended load of 1/4 metric ton. A rope connects the release lever to the embrasure. The weight moves on a bone axle greased with fat. Third scene. The house takes the form of a watchtower, and the southwest corner itself stretches upward by 3 human heights. The tower has narrow loopholes, and Darren drags all 6 forged pikes and the crossbow with steel bolts he bought from Ulmer into it. Fourth cut. The last evening before the full moon, Darren walks the spiral of the labyrinth for the 100th time, reciting each position aloud. Here the floor gives way, here a load falls, here is clay, here are traps, here's the dead zone under the overhang. He catches himself realizing that he isn't afraid and that this is precisely what frightens him. The red moon has risen, and the beacon responds to it at full strength. 2 red lights met over the valley. The horde did not come in a stream. The horde came as a wall. Darren watched from the tower as the forest squeezed out row after row of creatures and realized that the count would not be in the tens. The small fry poured into the labyrinth, and for the first hour, it was simply work. The creaking of traps, the crunching of the floorboards, the dull thuds of the cargo that Darren had lowered 4 times already, and by this point, the house had absorbed so much that the pulse of the foundation had merged into a steady hum. Sparks flowed like a river, and then the little creatures suddenly parted to the sides like water before a keel. Those summoned by the beacon emerged from the forest. There were 2 of them. The first was familiar, a plate-like creature with a torn paw that had vanished into the second moon. It had doubled in size, and its limp was gone. The second beast was worse. A long, low body clad in white bone armor, a snout without eyes. Instead of eyes, holes ran along its spine, and the holes sang, a high-pitched whistle that made teeth ache and thoughts go haywire. The singer led the way, and the small creatures, drawn by his whistle, threw themselves fearlessly into the traps, gnawing their way through with their bodies. A clever horde. Darren watched from the tower as the bony vermin piled themselves into the clay moat, layer upon layer, while the plate-clad one advanced as if on a causeway. The traps were devoured one after another. He descended from the tower into the house just as the plate-clad one entered the final bend of the spiral. Darren had saved a 1/4 metric ton load specifically for it. The lever, the whistle of the bone axle. The blow struck the creature between its neck and shoulder and drove it into the ground up to its elbows. It bellowed and crawled. Darren finished it off with a pike from the palisade for 20 long minutes, and the house began to devour it while it was still alive. But the singer didn't go into the labyrinth. The singer sat down at the far edge of the hunting ground, exactly beyond the 100-step boundary, and sang. Darren realized this later than he should have. The creature couldn't have known about the 100 steps, but the creature was sitting at 110 and driving the small creatures forward, and the house couldn't reach it. Someone had trained the horde. That thought was more terrifying than anything currently crawling up the hill. Darren grabbed his crossbow, climbed the tower, and waited for an opening. A whistle drove the little creatures forward in waves, and between the waves, the singer would raise his eyeless snout. Darren caught the 3rd such rise. The bolt entered the upper hole in its spine. The song broke off with a screech. The singer rolled across the field, and Darren did what only a madman would do. He stepped outside the palisade. He ran across his own hunting grounds along a path he knew by heart in the darkness amid the darting little creatures, and finished off the blind beast with an axe on his 101st step. Then he dragged the carcass over the bone ridge and into the circle while the little creature's claws tore at his back. The house reached out. Red ropes of light shot up from the ground, and Darren, lying beneath the carcass, listened as the house drank and as knowledge unfolded, vast and heavy. The singer gave 60 sparks, 45 plates, countless small creatures. Overnight, the house became twice as old. By dawn, what stood on the hill was no longer a hut. The walls had closed in to form a square with an inner courtyard. The tower had grown to 5 heights and was clad in bone battlements. A white palisade of fused bones rose from the foundation along the entire perimeter. Darren sat in the courtyard with his back to the warm stone while the dawn sun extinguished the moon, and he did not immediately realize that Senta was climbing the hill she had come as promised to see what would remain of him. She stood in the middle of the courtyard and turned slowly. The bone palisade, the tower, the singer's carcass, which the house was still finishing off. Her expression mirrored that of the foreman 3 moons ago. She approached Darren, slipped off her glove, and held out her hand. She said she had been wrong. She said that for the first time in 11 years, she was seeing a place where the horde wasn't merely weathered out, but gathered like a harvest. Then she put her glove back on, and her voice took on an official tone. She said she was obliged to report everything she had seen to the Baron. She said the Baron would hear the words fortress and harvest, and that after this report, the Baron would send more than just a scribe. Darren nodded. He looked past her toward the edge of the forest. There, against the backdrop of the lightening sky, a creature the size of a dog sat motionless on a bare rock. It hadn't attacked at night. It hadn't left with the horde. It had been staring at the fortress for a long time, calmly, the way a person counts the battlements of another's fortress. Then it turned and fled into the woods. Darren realized he'd seen a scout. The horde didn't just have fangs. The horde had someone who taught the singers to stop at 110 paces. Darren paid the Baron 30 silver coins, but realized that the Baron needed a pretext, not money, and to spite everyone, set up a beacon of the call, spending 40 sparks. On the 4th moon, the beacon drew a wall of creatures, including the grown-up scaly beast and the eyeless singer who commanded the horde and deliberately remained outside the 100-step boundary, which proves that an outsider knew the house's properties. Darren killed both of them, obtained more than 100 sparks, and the house grew into a small fortress with a tower, a courtyard, and a bone palisade, while Senta admitted her mistake but was obliged to report to Baron Valor. At dawn, Darren spotted a scout creature surveying the fortifications. The word fortress reached the people faster than it reached the Baron. A day after the moon, the first petitioners arrived at the gates of the hill, a widow with 2 children, whose house and Harlan stood right up against the wall, where stones from the besieging creatures flew every moon. An old tanner with a sore leg whom the council had expelled from the inner circle as a useless freeloader. 2 brothers, hunters who were tired of paying the tithe for the right to spend the night inside the wall. They stood by the bone palisade, wringing their caps, and asked for the same thing, to be let in during the red nights. "We'll repay you with our labor," they said. Darren looked down at them from the wall and did the math. He wasn't calculating mercy, he was calculating the burden. Water, grain, and outhouses, sleeping quarters in the cellar, extra hands on the cranks, and extra eyes on the walls. The math worked out in his favor. He opened the gate and set the price. Men to work during the day, women to dry meat and trim bowstrings, children to haul firewood and stay out from behind the palisade. Disobedience meant being cast out. By the 6th moon, 11 people were living within his walls. Harlan looked at this askance. Olveg sent word that Darren was luring away the workforce from the refuge. Darren replied that the workers themselves chose where they were safer, and then came what Senta had warned about. 2 days before the 6th moon, a mounted detachment emerged onto the road from across the river under Valor's red banner. 30 lances, a supply train, and a man in a black cloak leading the way. Olmer rode up the hill ahead of the detachment, reining in his horse, and blurted out everything he knew. The man in black was Gefried, the Baron's steward. The detachment was carrying a charter. According to the letter, the fortified settlement on the hill is declared an unauthorized fortress and is to be ceded to the Baron, while the builder, in recognition of his service, is to receive the position of overseer with his own house and a salary. Ulmer added on his own that, on average, Gefrid's overseers last only until the first quarrel. Gefrid climbed the hill around noon without a guard, and it was a show of force. He walked around the courtyard like a customer in a stable, touched the bone palisade, peered into the cellar, and spoke in a pleasant voice. He said that the Baron was delighted. He said that such talent deserved a place in the service. He unfolded the sealed document and suggested signing it before sunset, because after sunset, the red hours begin, and it would be more peaceful for the Baron to settle the matter before moonrise. Darren read the document slowly. In his previous life, he had read contracts that were later used to build structures, and he knew where the trap lay hidden in the paperwork. The trap lay in the third line from the bottom. Transfer of ownership, including all movable and immovable property and all persons taken under one's roof. 11 people were listed as an appendix to the house, like livestock. Darren rolled up the charter and returned it to Gefrid. He said he would think it over until morning. Gefrid smiled and said that not everyone gets to see the morning. The detachment set up camp at the foot of the hill between the fortress and the refuge. The plan was straightforward if the owner didn't sign that evening. Then at night, the spearmen would simply take the gate, because on a red night, any sensible person would let the soldiers in behind the walls of their own accord. Gefrid hadn't accounted for one thing. He had never seen what a red night was like on this hill. The moon rose for the 6th time, and the lighthouse began to shine. The horde emerged from the forest and marched up the hill as naturally as a river flowing into its bed. But at the foot of the hill, in the path of their advance, stood a camp, 30 spears, horses, campfires. Darren stood on the tower and saw it all at once. The wave advancing from the north, the camp breaking up in panic, Gefrid, in his black cloak, shouting at the soldiers, and the narrow window between the first and second waves, a quarter of an hour. He could watch. No one in the valley would have thrown a stone at him. The Baron had come to take his home, and the horde had settled the matter itself. Darren watched the soldiers running toward Harlan's gates, which did not open. The law of sanctuary. After sunset on a red night, no one is let in. The soldiers scrambled between the locked sanctuary and the onrushing wave, and then Darren struck the new bronze bell he'd bought from Ulmer and opened a passage in the labyrinth. He bellowed from the wall, cupping his fist to his mouth like a trumpet, that there was only one path, marked by red fires, and that anyone running past the fires would die in the traps. The soldiers ran toward the fires. The spiral let the men through and closed behind them like a maw. 26 made it through. The wave swept away, 4 at the foot of the spiral. Gefrid was among the first to reach the top. What followed was a night of work. Darren positioned the Baron's soldiers on the ramparts and walls just as he had positioned his own. Some of them were vomiting at the sight of the blood-drinking bone palisade. By 3 o'clock, some were already reloading their crossbows and grinning grimly. The wave was vicious and long. The beacon led 2 large ones. First came a hunchbacked beast covered in growths, which spat out chunks of its own armor like a catapult. Its growths broke through the turf covering the trench, and Darren lured it into a clay ditch by manipulating the lighthouse's lights, which the house had already learned to extinguish and ignite at will. Once in the clay, the hunchbacked creature was shot down with pikes from the palisade by the entire group. The second to arrive was the one Darren had been waiting for and fearing since the last moon. The beast did not come with the wave, but after it, at the dead of night, tall, thin, walking on 2 legs, a bone mask instead of a snout with eyes in the slits of the mask. Darren looked through the loophole and a chill ran through his stomach because the eyes were human. Not like human eyes, human. The beast walked along the palisade for 110 paces without ever straying from that line. It stood opposite the gate. It gazed at the lighthouse for a long time, Then it picked up a fragment of a fallen soldier spear from the ground, twirled it between its fingers, and carefully stuck it into the ground, point upward, exactly at the 100-pace mark, like a marker, like a signature, and it walked into the forest without looking back. Not a single creature climbed the hill after it left. The wave ended instantly, as if cut off. Darren stood by the embrasure until dawn, staring at the spear shard. Over the course of the night, the house had absorbed so much knowledge that it barely fit in his head. The threshold of form had been crossed. From now on, the house was called a fort. Deep paths had opened up, the forge of the flesh, root passages, the voice of the walls. Darren listened to it with half an ear. He was thinking about the eyes in the slits of the mask. In the morning, in the courtyard, Gefrid approached him. The steward was ashen from sleeplessness and stained with someone else's blood. Silently, he took out a sealed letter and tore it in half before his soldier's eyes. He said he would report to the Baron that the fortress could not be taken and that it would be foolish to lay a hand on the master. He said that the Baron didn't need this fortress, but rather what it was doing to the horde, and that this was what needed to be discussed, not taken away. Then he added quietly that 6 of his men were asking permission to stay on the hill, and he would pretend not to have heard that request. The soldiers were heading down the trampled hunting ground, while 11 of the hill's inhabitants were already scattering the bone dust, and Darren stood on the wall of his fort and must have felt victory he did not feel. He looked east. The sun rose at the appointed hour. The red moon had not gone away. It hung over the ridge, pale as a washed-out wound, yet red, and showed no sign of fading further. The 7-day cycle had been broken. Down below in Harlan, a bell tolled, and it would not stop. Darren looked at the 2 luminaries in the same sky and realized that all his moats, traps, and walls had been built according to the rule of 7 days. And the one who wore a bone mask and human eyes had just overturned that rule. Darren took 11 residents of Harlan under his protection, while Baron Weiler sent the steward Gefrid with 30 spearmen and a deed of transfer for the fortress, in which the people were included as an appendix to the property. In the 6th moon, the detachment's camp came under attack by a wave of Harlan soldiers. They were not let in, and Darren led the 26 survivors, including Gefrid, through the labyrinth, after which they jointly repelled the wave, killed the hunchbacked thrower. And the house attained the rank of a fort with new paths of forge flesh, roots, passages, and the voice of the walls. At night, a 2-legged beast in a bone mask with human eyes, one that knows the 100-step boundary, came and left a mark with a spear. In the morning, Gefrid tore up the letter, but the main threat revealed itself at dawn. The red moon had not left the sky, and the rule of 7 days was broken. It pounded on Harlan, pounded until noon, and fell silent only when the bell ringers' voices grew hoarse. Darren did not come down from the wall all day. The red moon hung over the ridge, pale but alive, and would not go away. By evening, it began to take on color again. The house's knowledge remained silent about the moon. The house knew about sparks and walls. The house knew nothing of the sky. The first unscheduled wave arrived at dusk on the 2nd day. It was sparse, a dozen or so stragglers without a leader. The labyrinth swallowed it up within an hour, and Darren didn't even get up to operate the levers. He had others man the levers, the widow's eldest son, one of the Hunter brothers, 2 of the Baron's soldiers, who never actually went down with the detachment but claimed to be wounded and stayed behind. He shuffled them around the positions until their hands began to do everything on their own. He told them that the valley used to have a 6-day respite, but now there was no respite, and everyone would take turns sleeping. The 3rd wave came a day after the 2nd. The 4th came a day and a half later. The rhythm broke down completely. The moon no longer faded. It breathed. It paled toward dawn and grew full by nightfall. And with each of its breaths, a new wave of creatures was squeezed out of the forest. A small, endless war would have worn down a lone fighter in a week. But Darren was no longer alone, and there was no longer just a hut with pits. He had rebuilt everything for his new life in 4 days. First cut. Darren takes the form of root tunnels, and the earth beneath the fort splits open on its own. Dry stone tunnels with red veins of light along their vaults spread downward and to the sides. One passage leads to a stream, and water now flows into the cellar without buckets and without risk. The second passage stretches toward the forest edge and ends with a bone cover beneath the turf. Darren stands in this passage and realizes he has gained what in that life was called a hidden rotation, the opportunity to get behind the enemy's lines. Second cut. The fort's courtyard is marked off with ropes into sections, and the 11 inhabitants are embedded in the defenses like teeth in a trap. The leatherworker with his injured leg sits by the embrasure and cuts straps for crossbow arms. The widow salts and smokes the meat of creatures that the knowledge of the house has marked as edible. Children haul bolts along the chute that Darren had installed along the wall so that no one would run about in the open air. Third cut. Night. A wave. Darren is no longer pacing the walls. He stands on the tower and commands with his voice and the bell. Lever 3. Extinguish the lights. Lower the eastern platform. The people below work in silence and with anger. The wave dies in a spiral before reaching the palisade. The house drinks. Fourth cut. Morning after the fifth unscheduled wave. Darren sleeps, standing up, leaning against a battle crenel of the tower, and it is not the alarm but the silence that wakes him. He looks down and sees that, without him, the men have gathered the debris, straightened the bent prongs of the traps, and restretched the woven shields. The fort was already functioning without his help, but everyone had only slept 3 hours, and their faces had turned gray. On the 6th day, the person Darren least expected to see climbed the hill. Elda Olveg walked with difficulty, leaning on his staff, followed by 2 council members. Darren met them at the gate and refrained from taunting them with his silence. Olveg spoke first. He said that Harlan had withstood 3 extra waves of attack, but would not survive a 4th. He said that the people had not slept for 6 days, that they were running out of arrows, and that the western section of the wall had been weakened by the besieging beasts and was being propped up by supports. He paused, and it was clear how the words were tearing at his throat. Then he said what he had come for. He asked for help. The old man who, 3 moons ago, had planned to burn this hill now stood by the bone palisade and pleaded. Darren looked at him and felt no compassion. In that life, he had seen structures crumble because 2 leaders were arguing over who was right. Being right was worth less than the wall. He said he would help and laid out his conditions. Harlan would put 20 men to work for him, and under his command they would build whatever he specified on the approaches to the refuge. Harlan would open his iron warehouse to him, and Harlan would forget the word filth forever. Olveg agreed to everything before Darren had even finished speaking. For the next 2 days between the waves, the hill and the shelter were built together. Darren would come down with a tape measure hanging from his belt and mark out the positions. He erected a jagged stone wall in front of Harlan's gates so that the besieging creatures would lose their momentum. He taught Harlan's men to dig wolf pits with double bottoms. He drove the men hard. At first, they grumbled under their breath that the old man was giving them too much to do, but by the evening of the 2nd day, they were running after him with spears at the ready, asking where to strike next. Brax followed him in silence, watching as he laid out the defenses. Then he spoke a single sentence. He said that for 40 years he'd believed that a refuge was walls, but now he saw that a refuge was calculation. The 7th night of the broken cycle arrived with a full red moon, and the wave was huge, the first real one since the collapse. The horde split into 2 streams, and Darren watched for the first time how his outer defenses worked. The broken wall in front of Harlan slowed the besiegers' advance, and spears met them from the shelter's walls. The wolf pits swallowed the small ones by the dozens, and the main wave, following old instincts, flowed toward the lighthouse and died in a spiral. By 3 o'clock in the morning, Darren noticed something new in the wave. The creatures were moving in links, 5 small ones and 1 medium-sized one, acting as the commander. The groups did not venture into the open passages. The groups were probing. One group threw themselves onto the decking of the covered trench all at once, and the decking gave way prematurely to no avail. The second unit settled by the clay ditch and waited. The third moved along the palisade for 110 paces, precisely following the mark made by a spear shard. They had been trained. Darren stood on the tower and felt a gaze from the darkness as clearly as one feels a hand on the back of one's head. He ordered the rear passage to be opened passage. 2 hunter brothers and 4 of the Baron's men emerged from beneath the turf at the edge of the woods behind the waiting squad and struck them in the back with crossbows within 10 heartbeats. The house made it to the carcasses. The passages paid for themselves on the very first night. By dawn, the wave had subsided. The moon had faded to the color of an old scar, but remained in the sky. Darren descended from the tower, and Senta was waiting for him in the courtyard. She had arrived during the night at the height of the wave, and instead of banging on the gate, she had taken her place on the wall with her crossbow alongside his men. The tanner had reported this to him. Senta handed Darren a rolled-up sheet of paper bearing a red seal. She said that Baron Vaylor had read Geifried's report 3 times. She said that the Baron was proposing a supply agreement, grain, iron, and men in exchange for cannonballs and for Darren to take charge of the defense of all 3 strongholds on the northern shore. She paused and added on her own. She said this was the first time she'd seen the Baron offer something rather than take it, and that this frightened her more than the hordes, because Vaylor only makes offers to those he couldn't count. Darren took the sheet and looked past her toward the east. There, above the ridge, hung the undying moon, and at the 100-step mark on the border, next to the spear shard, a second shard had appeared overnight. It was stuck point up, exactly 1 step away from the first. The count was on. Someone was marking every night that the fort was still standing. The red moon had stopped setting, and the waves came every day or 2, so Darren built a network of route-like tunnels with exits leading to the stream and the forest edge, and turned the inhabitants into permanent sentries. Olveg himself came to ask for help, and Darren, in exchange for iron and 20 workers, built a forward defense for Harlan, and during the great wave of creatures, they operated in units led by commanders for the first time and knew the 100-step limit, but a sortie through a route tunnel wiped out the waiting unit. Senta brought the Baron's contract for supplies in exchange for the defense of 3 refugees on the northern shore, and at the mark made by the spear shard, a second shard appeared, like a count of the knights. Darren signed the treaty with the Baron on the 4th day after that wave, and he signed it on his own terms. He struck out the clause regarding the Baron's governor at the fort. He added a clause stating that all the carcasses of the creatures killed at his positions belonged to the hill. Senta took the document away and returned 2 days later with the seal and the first convoy, 8 carts of grain, 3 carts of strip iron, and 40 men. The Baron hadn't sent soldiers. The Baron had sent masons, carpenters, and a gaunt woman named Meryl, who introduced herself as the master of the siege yard and declared from the threshold that she had come to see the man who thought he was better than her. Darren led her through the labyrinth. Meryl walked in silence, touching everything with her hands, the decking, the load's axles, the slopes of the moats. At the entrance, she stopped and asked over her shoulder where he had studied. Darren replied that he'd learned from his grandfather. Morel gave him a long look, the look of someone who'd been lied to and who'd assessed the quality of the lie. Then she said that his grandfather had been a genius and that she was staying. The fort was now growing from both sides. From the inside, the house was building it up, swallowing the sparks of the nightly waves. From the outside, hands were constructing it. First cut. G. Marl and the masons are erecting a second line of wild stone along the southern slope, and Darren is arguing with her over the plan until his voice is hoarse. She wants a straight wall. He wants a jagged one with niches. They're sketching with charcoal right on the wagon. By evening, Marl wipes away her design with her palm and says that the niches are better. Second cut. The forge of flesh is commissioned for 50 sparks, and a low structure with a bone furnace without fire rises in the corner of the courtyard. Darren places the armor of a hunchbacked thrower into the furnace, and by morning he retrieves plates as light as wood and as hard as steel.
The forge transforms the dead into the useful. People cross themselves and wear the plates on their chests.
Third scene. The voice of the walls is accepted for 40 sparks. Now Darren hears through the walls. He stands in the basement and feels every touch against the palisade as if it were a touch against his own skin. At night, he wakes up a minute before the sentry in the tower opens his mouth. Fourth cut. A convoy from the third refuge brings children and the elderly to the hill for lodging, and the widow is already in charge of an entire underground floor, just as she once ran her kitchen. The tunnels smell of bread. The fort had become a small town before Darren even noticed it. 82 people, a cattle pen, a line at the well in the mornings, and every night, the red moon and the waves. The waves now died far from the walls. The spiral devoured them out in the open. People had grown accustomed to sleeping to the rumble of the traps as if it were rain. The habit was dangerous, and Darren knew it. He knew it so well that he forbade himself from rejoicing. Every victory brought someone bigger. That rule had never failed. On the 12th night of the broken cycle, it came for its due. The wave began as usual and died down as usual, and an hour after it ended, the voice of the walls struck Darren's nerves like a burn. Something touched the palisade. It didn't strike. It touched. He leaped up to the tower. By the western wall, in the dead zone, where the lights couldn't reach, stood 6 figures, bipeds in bone armor. They weren't breaking through the palisade. They were listening to it. One pressed his palm against a bone and ran it over it like a healer over a patient's chest. Darren ordered the lights on, and by the time the beacon's beams flooded the dead zone, the 6 were already retreating back into the darkness. In tight formation, covering one another, the last one held a fragment of a bone tooth in his hand. They had come for a sample. In the morning, Darren convened a council at the fort. Merrill, Brax, who now lived on the hill across the way, the senior of the Baron's soldiers, named Cold, Ulmer, who had arrived with the supply train. He laid everything out before them, the squads with their commanders, the 100-step boundary, the singer who knew where to sit, the creature in a mask with human eyes, the 6 who were listening to the wall, and the 2 spear shards at the boundary which had now become 12, one for each knight. He said it wasn't a force of nature fighting against them. An engineer was fighting against them. The word hung over the table. Merrill asked where the horde had gotten an engineer. Darren replied that he didn't know but intended to find out. He said they'd had enough of responding to the waves. He said he would go into the forest. Silence fell over the table. Brax was the first to speak, saying that this meant certain death. He said that in 40 years, no one had ventured into the forest beyond the edge since the cycle broke. Cold said he wouldn't send people on a suicide mission. Only Merrill looked at Darren and remained silent. Then she asked what he wanted to find. Darren answered honestly. He wanted to find the place from which the horde emerged. Because every wave has a source, and whoever leaves, marks at its edge, comes from somewhere and goes somewhere. He wouldn't fight. He would observe and count. Reconnaissance by combat is a failure of reconnaissance. The argument went on until noon, and Darren won it because he proposed something the soldiers couldn't object to. He wouldn't go overland. He'd go beneath the ground. His knowledge from home confirmed it. The root tunnels could be extended in any direction as long as there were enough sparks. The growth rate was 100 steps per night. In 20 nights, the root network will reach the deep forest and the old burnt-out area, from which, according to Brax, the densest waves always emerged. The fort will remain under the command of Morel and Kolda. The voice of the walls operates along the entire length of the roots, and Darren will be able to hear his home even from beneath the forest. The next 20 nights became the strangest in the fort's history. Above, the familiar war raged on. The waves spiraled and died away. Below, beneath the tree roots, the stone passageway grew with a crunching sound. And every night, Darren would descend and walk along it to its fresh end, marking his steps on a bone tag. The house pulled the passageway and drank in the waves at the same time, and the sparks melted faster than they accumulated. The list of forms had faded. The house gave everything away in length. On the 15th night, the passage passed beneath the bed of a dead stream, and its walls grew cold. On the 18th, Darren heard a sound from above for the first time, through the thickness of the earth. Rhythmic, heavy, as if something enormous were breathing above. On the 20th night, the passage ran into emptiness. The house stopped growing of its own accord, and knowledge spoke briefly. There was no earth beyond. Darren took a hidden lantern with a shutter, a crossbow, and a knife. He forbade himself from taking anyone else. The bone cover swung open silently among the roots of an old oak, and Darren climbed out into a forest that no living person in the valley had ever seen. The old soot was not soot. The trees stood black, but not from fire. They were entwined with the same bone-like substance as his palisade. Red veins of light ran upward along the trunks, and all the veins flowed in one direction, toward the center of the scorched area. Darren walked from shadow to shadow for half an hour and emerged at the edge of the hollow. He lay face down on the ridge and looked down, and his hand instinctively clamped over his mouth to keep from making a sound. In the hollow stood a house. Huge, sickly, wrong. Bone towers had fused into a cluster. The walls were breathing. In the center, where the courtyard should have been, a funnel gaped, shrouded in a film of red light, and from this film, like from a hole in the ice, creatures were crawling out. Wet, new. They crawled out, formed chains, and disappeared into the forest. The waves weren't coming from the forest. The waves were born here. And along the wall of this house, between the bone battlements, a familiar figure was walking, tall, thin, wearing a mask. She walked as a master walks along his own wall. She stopped and slowly turned its head exactly toward the spot where, 300 paces away on the ridge, Darren lay crouched close to the ground. The fort had grown into a settlement of 82 people, with Master Marl, a second stone line of forges transforming flesh into armor, and the voice of the walls through which Darren senses the fortifications. Scouting creatures listened at the palisade and took a bone sample, so over the course of 20 nights, Darren dug a root tunnel deep into the forest, using up almost all his sparks. On the old ash field, he found the source of the waves. It was a massive, alien, diseased structure with a funnel from which creatures were born, and along its wall walked a being in a bone mask that turned its head toward Darren's hiding place. Darren did not run. Running makes noise, and noise means death. He slid down the ridge on his back, keeping his stomach pressed against the ground, and kept his eyes fixed on the black jagged teeth on the wall of the alien house. The masked figure stood motionless, looking in his direction. Then it raised its hand, not toward him, upward, and the red veins on the trees around the hollow went out all at once, like candles being blown out. The forest went blind. Darren understood that gesture only when he reached the very cover of the passage, when his heart stopped pounding in his ears. They had shown him. They had shown him their power over this place just as clearly as he himself had shown his power with the lighthouse beams. It wasn't a threat. It was an invitation to converse in the language spoken by the masters of these houses. He slid down into the passage, pushed the cover shut, and walked to the fort for 4 hours without feeling his legs. At the fort, he climbed from the basement to the tower and gazed at the forest until dawn. The pursuers didn't come. The wave didn't come that night either, for the first time in 13 nights. In the morning, he gathered the same council and told them everything about the hollow, about the cluster house, about the funnel that gave birth to creatures, and about the gesture with the lights. Merrill listened, pale. Brax listened, his face as dark as night. Cold asked if they could burn it down. Darren replied that he'd been asking himself the same thing the whole way back, and that they wouldn't like the answer. Over the course of 7 moons, his fort had gathered enough power to build stone walls, a tower, and roots. That house had stood in the forest for what looked like well over a decade, and it held sparks like a lake holds water. To go there with pikes would be to feed it. Ulmer asked what that masked creature wanted then, and Darren said aloud what he'd been afraid to admit even to himself. She wants the same thing he himself would want if he were in her place. She doesn't need a fort. She needs his house. Houses drink death and grow. So the juiciest morsel for a house is another house. The waves weren't a siege. The waves were fodder, and the masked one drove meat up the hill for 7 moons in a row and watched as the little house grew fat, like a pig for a feast. They sat in silence at the table for a long time. Then Marl asked where he'd gotten that from, and Darien laid it all out. That night, on the way back, the knowledge of the house spoke of its own accord. For the first time, it wasn't in response to his question. It showed him a line that hadn't been there before. The line was called Memory of the Root. With 100 sparks, the house could raise from its foundation what the stones remembered. Darren took shape that very morning before the council, and the stones remembered the grandfather, not his face, his voice, and his hands. 40 years ago, his grandfather had not come to the valley alone. There were 3 brothers, and each had a seed of a house, a bone grain the size of a fist. The stones did not remember where the grains had come from. His grandfather planted his on this hill and fed it quietly and sparingly with carrion and packs of wolves. He was afraid of awakening the seed's hunger, and so the house grew for 40 years until it reached the size of a hut. The middle brother planted his seed across the river, and his house burned down along with him when the neighbors saw the walls drinking blood. And the eldest brother went into the deep forest. The eldest brother thought grandfather was a coward. The eldest brother wanted to find out how fast the house could grow if he spared no food. The root's memory broke off at the moment when the grandfather looked toward the forest at the glow of the first blood moon and told the stones that the eldest had done it after all. Darren finished, and in the room, one could hear the well gate creaking in the yard. The moons began 40 years ago. Exactly when the grandfather's older brother decided not to skimp on food, the house in the hollow first devoured the beasts, then that wasn't enough and it began to give birth to beasts itself, driving them toward the shelters and reaping death on both sides. Each wave fed it twice with the dead beasts and the dead people whose bodies the horde dragged off into the forest. For 40 years, the valley paid its tribute, not knowing to whom. And the man who started it all still walked along his wall wearing a mask with human eyes. Brax stood up and went out into the yard. You could hear him retching by the wall. He returned, sat down, and said that his father had died on the 3rd moon 40 years ago and his body had never been found. He said this in an even voice, and that voice sent a chill down everyone's spine. Cold asked what would happen next. And Darren laid out on the table a bone token with the calculations he'd been making all night. He said they didn't have the strength to take the basin, and it wouldn't be for many moons yet. He said the mask had the strength to take the fort, but wasn't doing so. So either something was stopping her or she needed something. He listed them on his fingers. Markers at the border, a bone sample taken, scouts who listened to the wall, lights extinguished as a gesture. The mask is studying his house just as he himself would study a foreign mechanism, carefully, without haste. That's how you study something you're afraid of breaking. There was only one conclusion. There is something in the small house that the big one doesn't have, and until the mask figured out exactly what it was, the fort would go on living. That meant the task was simple and terrifying, to be the first to find out. For the next 6 days, the fort led a double life. Upstairs, construction was underway and Marl was driving the second line toward the gates. Downstairs, Darren was interrogating his own house. First cut. Darren sits in the basement amid red veins and asks knowledge questions, one by one, carefully phrasing them just as he once did when submitting requests to the archives. Knowledge answers precisely what is asked. He asks how this grain differed from his older brother's grain. Knowledge remains silent for a long time. Then he answers with 2 words, feed order. Second scene. Darren and Marl conduct an experiment. The forge of flesh receives the carcass of a creature killed by a trap without human intervention. Then the carcass of the creature that Darren killed himself. The plates from the second carcass turn out twice as strong. The house assimilates better what is killed by the master's will rather than by a mechanism. Meryl takes notes, and the charcoal trembles in her fingers. Third scene, Night Wave. For the first time, Darren orders not to kill a creature, but to capture it alive. A small ghoul is bound with straps and lowered behind the palisade into the circle. The house does not touch the living. Red veins flow around the bound creature like water around a stone. The house awaits death but does not take it itself. Knowledge confirms it. The house cannot kill. The house can only receive. Fourth scene. Darren stands over the bound ghoul with a knife and hesitates. Then he cuts, and at the moment the house drinks, he hears through the voice of the walls something he has never heard before. A faint note, almost joy. He shudders, and for the first time in 7 moons, he asks himself whom he has raised on this hill. On the 7th day, 100 paces from the border, something other than a spear appeared. The morning sentry rang the bell, and Darren climbed the wall. At the mark on the trampled field lay a man, alive, bound with bone cords, wearing the tattered dress of a woman from a distant refuge. The horde never left anyone alive. The horde dragged the bodies away. But this woman had been brought here and placed precisely on the boundary, just as one would place a coin on a counter. The mask was beginning a bargain, and as Darren looked at the bound figure on his hunting ground, he realized 2 things at once. First, he was being offered the finest prey to see if he would take it. Second, the very fact of the bargain meant that the mask wanted something from him that was alive and given willingly, something that could not be taken by force. Darren walked away from the hollow without being pursued, and through the form of the root's memory, learned that 40 years ago, 3 brothers had brought the bone seeds of houses into the valley. The grandfather raised the small house on meager rations, while the eldest brother spared no rations in the forest, and his house gave rise to the blood moons and waves as a way to gather death from both sides. Experiments showed that a house cannot kill on its own, but best assimilates what is killed by its master's will, and that the mask is studying the small house, searching within it for something the large one lacks. In the morning, at the 100-step border, the horde left a bound woman alive for the first time as a bargaining chip. Darren went down to retrieve the woman himself. He forbade anyone from opening the main gates and exited through the root passage at the edge of the forest with Cold and a single crossbowman providing cover. The field was empty. The forest was so thick with silence that the stillness pressed against his ears. Darren cut through the bone bindings, and they crumbled to dust the moment his knife touched them. There was no need to cut them. One simply had to want to remove them. Another message. The woman was conscious, but not in her right mind. They brought her to the gate and handed her over to the widow. She drank water, her teeth chattering against the bucket, and spoke in broken sentences. Her name was Tana. Her refuge beyond the far ford had fallen 8 days ago. The walls had been torn down in a single night. They didn't kill the people. They took the people away, in a column, deep into the forest. She ran and they caught her. But they didn't kill her or take her away with the others. They kept her in the forest for 3 days in a bone cage, and a creature in a mask would come and stare at her. And then they brought her here. Before leaving, the masked creature did the thing that made Tana start trembling every time she retold the story. The creature took off its mask. Tana saw its face. She said it was the face of an old man, an ordinary human face, that of a very old man, and that the old man leaned toward her and said in a human voice a single phrase that he ordered her to relay to the master of the little house, word for word. Darren leaned in closer. Tana gathered her courage and spoke, "Ask your house which of you 2 is the master." The phrase fell upon Darren like a stone into a well and kept falling for a long time. He thanked Tana, ordered that she be fed, and told them not to bother her with questions. As for himself, he went down to the basement and sat there until dark, staring at the red veins. He counted the last moons as one counts beads on a rosary. The house began suggesting forms more and more often on its own. The house unlocked the root's memory without being asked. The house rejoiced at the death of the bound wanderer. The house grew faster than Darren could decide where it should grow. Who, within these walls, had the final say? He pushed these thoughts aside for 6 days because there was no time for them. The refuge beyond the ford had fallen, and this changed the entire map of the war. The waves crashing against the fort had almost ceased. Instead, from the tower, they now saw the glow in the south every night. The horde had stopped feeding the small house and had begun to devour the valley. The mask's strategy was as clear as day. You can't take someone else's house by force. Take it by starvation. Without waves, there are no sparks. Without sparks, there is no growth. And while you're at it, reap the harvest from everyone still hiding behind the walls. 6 days later, Baron Valor arrived at the fort, alone, with 50 horsemen, along with Gefrid and Senta. The Baron turned out to be an elderly, heavy-set man with the eyes of an old accountant. He didn't bother looking at the labyrinth. He climbed the tower, looked at the glow in the south, and asked without preamble how many people Darren could accommodate within its walls if the shelters on the southern shore were evacuated. Darren replied that with the completion of the second line, 400. The Baron nodded and said that wasn't enough. He said that 11,000 people lived in the valley beyond all the walls, and that if things continued this way, by winter there would be 5,000 left. He turned away from the battlements and looked Darren in the face. He said he had read both reports. He said he didn't believe in miracles, but he believed in numbers, and the numbers were clear. The only place in the valley where the horde was dying faster than it was arriving was the hill, so either the hill would teach everyone a lesson, or the hill would remain the capital of a graveyard. Then the Baron did something no one expected. He unfastened the governor's seal from his belt and placed it on the battlement between himself and Darren. He said he wasn't offering service. He said he was offering an alliance. All the forges in the valley, all their labor, all their treasury for a single task that Darren would name. Darren looked at the seal and heard Marl arguing with the masons down in the courtyard, the gate creaking and his house breathing. And he named the task. He said they needed to build a second house. It grew quiet. Gefride asked him to repeat it, and Darren laid out for them what he'd been working on since the night before in the cellar. The hollow cannot be conquered with steel because every death at its walls feeds it. The hollow can only be devoured by that which feeds on it in the same way. Another house. In his fortress, there is a forge of flesh, there are roots, and there is knowledge that is silent, but answers. He asked the knowledge if it were possible to separate the seed from the house. The knowledge replied that it was possible. At the cost of half of all the accumulated sparks, the house could give birth to a seed. The seed is planted in the ground, and a new house grows wherever its new master leads it. He proposed growing a house weapon, to plant the seed not here, but on the path between the hollow and the valley, to feed it with all the power of the barony, purposefully, quickly, and when it grows strong, to bring the two forest homes face to face. Let the great house of the masks and the young house of the baron devour one another, and the fort would remain the third. Marl was the first to say that this was madness. She said they were going to fight fire with fire. Brack said they didn't need a second master in a mask like that, and asked who would hold the new seed in their hands. And then Darren said the hardest part. The one who must hold the grain is the one who already knows how to listen to the house and not lose himself. And so that he doesn't become a second old man in a mask, everyone currently at this table will stand beside him with the right to kill him if he begins to change. He said this calmly. In that life, he had seen how people take on objects that later bury them. He knew the weight of such words. The Baron didn't hesitate. The Baron was an accountant, not a prophet. He took the seal from the tooth, slipped it to Gefrid, and told him to consider everything the hill asked for as paid in advance. That night, Darren went down to the cellar for the seed. He stood in the center of the circle of red veins and recited the incantation. And for the first time in 7 moons, the house did not obey immediately. The veins froze. Knowledge unfolded in his mind, heavily and slowly, and for the first time spoke not in lines of answers, but in something resembling a voice. It asked why the master needed a second house when the first could be made great. It showed him images surged through Darren like water through a breached dam, a fortress sprawling across the entire valley, bone walls stretching to the horizon, a moon red forever and an eternal harvest of sparks, and he himself on the tower. Tall, thin, wearing a comfortable, lightweight mask that protected his face so well. Darren stood in the cold basement and looked at his own dream, turned inside out, and he finally understood the old man's words. Ask your home which of you two is the master. The old man wasn't mocking him. The old man was warning him. 40 years ago, he too had been a man who simply wanted to protect his own and spared no expense. Houses do not seize their masters by force. Houses make offers every day, a little more each time, until all that remains of a person is a mask. Darren answered the house aloud because he could not remain silent. He said he had heard. He said that the house would face a great war and more sparks than any house in the valley had ever seen, but he would take the seed now, and if the house refused, the master would cease to kill of his own will, and the house would revert to its state 40 years ago, to carrion and wolf packs. The veins burned evenly. Then the floor in the center of the circle split open, and a bone seed the size of a fist rose from the stone. Warm, heavy. Darren took it in both hands and felt it quietly draw warmth from his palms. Knowledge spoke briefly. Half the sparks have been written off, and it added 2 more words that Darren hadn't asked for. See you later. The rescued Tana relayed the words of the old man in the mask, who had ordered her to ask her home which of the two was the master, while the horde changed tactics and began to starve the small house out of its refuge in the Sea Valley. Baron Vaylor arrived in person and offered an alliance with all the barony's resources, and Darren set the task of growing a second house, a weapon, from the seed of the small house on the way to the basin to pit the 2 forest houses against each other. And the council was granted the right to kill Darren if he began to change. For the first time, the house resisted, showing Darren a vision of himself wearing a mask, but under the threat of starvation, it handed over the seed, sacrificing half of its sparks, and bid farewell with the words, "Until we meet again." They spent 3 days choosing a planting site and selected it based on calculation rather than convenience. A dry hill above an old road, an hour and a half's walk from the fort, and 4 hours from the basin with water from a spring. With an open field to the north, from where the waves would come, Darren named the spot, and Merrill marked it with stakes, just as one marks a foundation. They planted the seed at dawn, without any rituals. Darren dug a hole 2 cubits deep, placed the grain inside, and was the first to throw dirt over it. Then he did what they'd discussed at the council until they were hoarse. He slit his palm and let the blood fall onto the covered hole. The knowledge of the small house held that the house would recognize as its master the one whose will and blood touched the grain first. An hour later, the earth above the hole settled, and a white sprout as thick as a finger emerged from it. By evening, the sprout had become a pillar as tall as a man. The young house grew at a rate that frightened even Darren. Then the feeding began, and it was work the valley had never seen before. The first harvest. Caravans from all the refuges were traveling along the old road toward the new hill. The Baron kept his word. Wagons carried the carcasses of creatures slaughtered overnight on the walls of Harlon and the southern forts. Darren stood by the sprout and guided each carcass into the circle with his own hand, because the young house, like the old one, responds best to its master's will. By the end of the first week, his fingers are stiff and won't straighten. Second cut, a military camp springs up around the young house. Cold commands 100 of the Baron's men. Morel erects a temporary palisade around the sprout and lays out the first hunting grounds according to the fort's blueprints. At night, waves of creatures heading for the valley run aground against the new defensive stronghold, and the young house drinks its first death. Third cut. Darren dashes between 2 hills along the route path that the house had extended to the camp over 6 nights. He sleeps in the path, 2 hours at a time. The voice of the walls now resounds within him as 2 voices. The old house hums steadily and deeply. The young one rings out thinly and eagerly like a puppy whining for food. Fourth cut, the 20th day. In place of the sprout stands a bone tower 5 heights tall, skirted by walls, and the young house takes on its first form without a hint from its master. It grows thorns on its walls all by itself. The young house's knowledge is brief and hungry. It knows 3 words: eat, grow, more. The mask responded on the 23rd day. At night, the camp sentries saw that the forest to the north was glowing. By midnight, a horde unlike anyone had ever seen emerged onto the field in front of the young house. It did not flow, it formed. The ranks assembled into columns. The columns formed wedges. Behind the wedges came siege beasts with bone shields on their muzzles. Behind the siege beasts, dozens of backs carried something long and white, resembling a battering ram made of a single piece of bone. And behind all of this, at the edge of the light, stood an old man in a mask, making no attempt to hide. Darren watched the formation from the tower of the young house and felt a chill run down his spine. The masked one had set his sights entirely on the new house. The logic was as clear as ice. For 40 years, the old man had known that the only threat to his house was another house, and he wasn't going to wait until the pup grew into a wolf. The battle began an hour before midnight and raged until dawn, then all day, and then through another night. The first onslaught wiped out the outer trap fields in an hour. The wedges pressed forward over their dead without slowing down. The young house absorbed the blows and grew right in the midst of battle. Its walls thickened under the impact. Darren stood on its tower and did what he did best in the valley. He counted and commanded. He drove the Baron's men along the walls in rotations marked by the bell. He lowered loads and set fire to the stored oil in the pockets of the broken walls. He opened the route passage and launched sorties into the rear of the wedges. By dawn on the first day, the field was so littered with bodies that the wedges were no longer advancing across the ground, but over corpses, and the young fortress hummed with power. It grew faster than the horde could break it down. By noon, Darren allowed himself to believe that the plan was working. And at that moment, the mask revealed why it had actually come. The bone-battering ram, carried by dozens of backs, turned away from the walls of the young house. The columns parted, and the battering ram passed by, heading south along the old road toward the fort. Darren stood on the tower and watched as half the horde broke away from the siege and marched in column toward the place where, an hour and a half's march away, stood his real walls, his people, the widow and her children, the tanner and Tana, 82 people, plus another 300 who had been taken in over the past few weeks, under the protection of the garrison that he himself had halved for the sake of the new hill. Everything that had unfolded that night was a trade-off. Masca was paying with thousands of creatures to ensure that Darren, with his strength and his attention, would be firmly tied down at the young house. The voice of the old fort's wall struck him with alarm through the root. Darren made his decision in 3 heartbeats, and the decision tore him in 2. He left the young house, he handed command over to Cole and Merrill, shouted the situation to them, and dove into the route passage. He ran underground for an hour and a half in the red twilight, and the voice of the fort's walls rang out within him, growing louder and more terrifying. Blows. The trembling of the palisade, the crackling of a distant beam. He burst out of the basement into the fort's courtyard just as the battering ram struck the gate for the second time. What followed was the longest day of his second life. The fort held out with everything it had stockpiled over 7 moons. Blacksmith's plates on the men, reserve supplies, fire, the root tunnels through which Brax and the hunters would slip into the rear and douse the battering ram with resin until it caught fire and collapsed. The smoke was so thick that the red veins in his eyes blinded him. By sunset, the horde at the fort had dwindled and receded, and then, standing on the gnawed-away wall, Darren heard something through a distant root that made his legs give way. The young house was screaming. Not with a voice, with knowledge. A thin, greedy ringing broke into a howl. Darren crawled to the tower and looked north through Ulmer's telescope. A red glow hung over the distant hill. The siege of the young house was not a diversion. The diversion was the attack on the fort. While Darren was rescuing his men, the old man had redirected the main assault back. Everything had been the opposite from the very beginning. The second column returned to the young house at dusk, reinforced by fresh waves from the crater, and struck just as Darren, with his will and his count, was an hour and a half underground. Cold held the walls. Marl held the walls. But the young house was a puppy, and the puppy was left without a master on the first real night of its life. Darren dove back into the root tunnel without waiting to hear the report from his own wall. He ran underground and heard the ringing of the young house grow fainter. Not because the battle was subsiding, it was because the house was weakening. Halfway there, the ringing faltered and changed. A second note appeared in it, low, steady, full, familiar to the point of nausea. That was how the house hummed in the hollow. The old man wasn't breaking the young house. The old man was doing to it what he had been doing to the entire valley for 40 years. He was overfeeding it. A horde would climb the walls of the pup and die on them by the thousands of their own accord. And the young house could not help but drink. It drank more than it could hold. It was bursting with the deaths of others, served up by a foreign will. And through that death, as through an open door, the voice of the elder house entered him. Darren stumbled out of the passageway into the camp an hour before dawn. The walls of the young house stood. The siege was rolling back on its own. Cold ran toward him across the courtyard with the face of a man who had won a battle and didn't understand why he was afraid, and Darren looked past him at the bone tower he himself had erected and fed. Thin veins crept slowly up the white bone from the base to the top, not red, black, and at the very top of the tower, perched on a battlement, sat a scout creature the size of a dog, that very one. It wasn't hiding. It sat there just as a messenger who delivered a letter would sit. Darren stood beneath his own tower and asked aloud in a hoarse voice whether his home could hear him, and the young home answered in his head, not with its own high-pitched ring. It answered in a calm, old voice from the other side of the forest. The voice said that the puppy had eaten well, and that now, between him and the old man, they had 2 houses between the 2 of them against Darren's one, and that the deal, which Darren had never even asked about at the border, was still in effect. The price remained the same. The owner would give up his house voluntarily. In exchange, the old man would let the valley go. Everyone alive. 1 moon to think it over, and if there's no answer, then on the next red night, both forest houses will come to the fort together. They planted the seed on the hill between the fort and the hollow. Darren bound the young house with blood, and over 20 days fed it with wagon loads from the entire barony all the way to the bone tower with its walls. The old man in the mask unleashed an army with a bone-battering ram upon the young house, lured Darren out with a feigned attack on the fort, and then overfed the now ownerless pup with the voluntary deaths of his horde. Through this torrent, he entered it with black veins, subjugating the young house to himself. In the voice of the captured house, the old man announced the terms. Either Darren voluntarily surrenders his house, and the valley is released alive, or in 1 moon's time, both forest houses will attack the fort together. The morning after the young house was captured was as quiet as the morning after a funeral. The besiegers had retreated into the forest, every last one of them. Mountains of carcasses remained on the field, which the young house consumed slowly and steadily, and it was that very steadiness that was the worst of all. The pup no longer rang out. The pup hummed with a strange, sated bass. Darren spent 3 days at the camp by the Black Tower, doing what he knew how to do. He examined the damage. First cut. Darren stands at the foot of the captured tower and places his palm on the bone. The black veins beneath his palm are cold. But deeper beneath them, he feels a thin, warm thread, his own blood. The first blood on the grain. The old man drenched the pup with someone else's death from above. But the first right lies at the very bottom, and it hasn't been erased. It sleeps. Second cut. Darren conducts an experiment with Merrill. He commands the young house to do the simplest thing. Grow a thorn. The house does not hear him. Then Darren cuts his palm, applies the blood to the bone, and repeats the command. The thorn does not grow, but the black vein beneath his palm lightens to gray for a moment. Merrill records the time, 4 heartbeats, then the blackness returns. Third cut. At night, Darren descends into the root passage and speaks with his elder home. He asks how the elder home is holding the younger one. Knowledge answers slowly, and for the first time, Darren hears something resembling reluctance in the replies. The house replies that it is holding the flow. As long as a stranger's death brought about by a stranger's will flows into the younger one, the elder's voice resounds within him without ceasing. Darren asks what will happen if the flow is interrupted. Knowledge is silent for a long time. Then it replies that in that case, the first blood will decide everything. Fourth cut. Darren steps out of the passage at dawn and sees that at the edge of the camp, on a trampled field, the shards of spears are stuck in the ground. 29 of them, exactly the number of nights remaining until the promised deadline. They were brought and arranged in a single night, like a calendar. The old man knew how to remind them. On the fourth day, Darren convened a grand council at the fort. The Baron arrived in person. They sat crowded together. Baron Gefried, Senta, Marl, Brax, Cold Ulmer, and Olveg, whom Darren had summoned for the first time. Darren laid out on the table everything he knew and everything he didn't know. The old man's conditions, the black veins, the sleeping first blood, the calendar of copies. Olveg asked what half the table was thinking. He asked why they shouldn't hand over the house. The old man promises to let the valley go free. 11,000 lives in exchange for a single fortress. Darren had been expecting this question and didn't answer right away. He said he'd been thinking about it all night, and that the answer had been prompted not by pride, but by the memory of the root. He told everyone to remember what the old man had been doing for 40 years. The old man didn't kill the valley. The old man milked it. The waves took away just enough so that the shelters wouldn't die out and could continue to give birth, build, and die according to schedule. The valley was not the old man's enemy. The valley was his field. And now, on that field, a second home had grown, one that had learned to grind down the waves. The field had become dangerous. The old man didn't need Darren's fortress as a trophy. He needed to ensure there was no second master in the valley. To give up the house meant giving up the only thing that made the old man willing to bargain. After that, promises would be worth no more than his 40 years of waves had been. Senta asked about the second one, about what everyone was keeping quiet about. She asked what the old man did with the people he took away. Columns of people from the fallen shelters went into the forest alive, and no one ever saw them dead. And then Tana, whom Darren had brought to the council, stood up. She spoke quietly and evenly, the way people do when they've already given up. She said there wasn't just one bone cage in the forest. There were many cages, rows of them. She heard voices behind the walls of her own cage, children's voices too. They were being fed, they were being held captive. The old man would come and listen to the cages the way a master listens to his granary. She said she'd only realized this now after everything she'd heard at this table. The elder house stores people the way grain is stored for a hungry winter, a living stockpile of death in case the waves stop paying off. It grew very quiet around the table. Brack sat with his eyes closed, his fists resting on the table like two stones. The Baron stared at the tabletop and counted. Then he raised his head and said one word. "How many?" Darren understood the question. The Baron was asking how many people might be in the cages. Darren counted aloud. 3 fallen shelters in the last month. Convoys taken away over the years, spoken of as missing in action. That meant there were between 800 and 1,500 people alive inside the basin right now. That changed everything. Storming the basin had always been madness. Now, any fire directed at the walls of the main house was fire directed at a barn full of people. And surrendering the fort wouldn't save these people at all. They weren't hostages in a deal. They were provisions. Darren advised the council to keep arguing until the very end, and when everyone had hit a dead end, he laid out the plan he'd been devising for 3 nights. He said the old man had made one mistake. The old man had extended his voice into the captured young house, a constant open channel from the basin to the Black Tower, a channel through which obedience flows, but every channel has 2 ends. Knowledge confirmed this through the reluctance of its silence. If, at the appointed hour, the flow of another's death into the young house were cut off and the first blood were awakened, the channel would not close instantly. For a few minutes, the young house would become an open door into the elder's inner self, and one need not enter through that door oneself. Through it, one can force the elder to drink. The house cannot kill, but neither can it refuse to accept death offered by the will of its master. This is the law of the grain. If, at the hour the door is open, the Old One's own horde is dying at the walls of the pit, then by the right of Daren's first blood, their death will flow not into the elder, but through the young house into the fort. For the first time in 40 years, the Old One will begin to starve in the midst of his own feast. The plan was as fragile as a bridge made of a single hair. Everything depended on the old man himself, leading his horde to his own walls at the appointed hour, and Daren knew only one way to achieve this. The old man must believe that he is getting what he has been hunting for 40 years. Daren told the council that in 29 days he would go to the Hollow and voluntarily surrender his house for real. He would begin the actual handover ceremony because the old man couldn't be fooled by a fake, and he would cut the ceremony short at the one point where it could still be cut short. Morel asked what would happen if he didn't manage to cut it short in time. Daren answered honestly. Then the council would receive the right they had agreed upon, and he added that he would write the will in advance. Daren discovered that his first blood on the grain of the young house had not been erased, but merely buried under a constant stream of others' deaths flowing through the channel of subjugation from the pit. Tana revealed that the old man kept rows of cages in the pit containing hundreds of living people as a food supply, so neither an assault nor the surrender of the fort would save them. Daren's plan was approved by the council. In 29 days, he would begin the actual ritual of voluntarily surrendering his home so that the old man could draw the horde toward the basin. And at the moment the ritual was broken, the awakened first blood would transform the captured young house into an open door through which the horde's death would flow from the elder house into the fort. 29 days flew by like a single long day without nights. The fort and the entire valley were preparing for the hour that could not be spoken of aloud, not even within the walls. The old man had left his eyes in the valley, scout creatures perched on distant rocks every morning and counted the enemy's battlements. Therefore, the preparations took two forms. Everyone saw the outer layer. 8 people knew about the inner layer. The first phase of the outer preparations, the fort was ostentatiously preparing to surrender. Daren ordered some of the outer traps to be dismantled and the iron loaded onto wagons. From the outside, it looked like they were hauling away valuables before leaving. The people in the fort grumbled, and this grumbling was genuine because they weren't being told the truth. Olveg would come to shame Daren in front of the scouts on the distant rocks and shout at the top of his lungs that the master of the hill was the valley for his own skin. The old man must have heard that cry, the second cut of the undergarments. At night, in the root tunnels, the reverse work was underway. The forge of the flesh was forging not plates, but tips for the crossbows that Maril was assembling in the underground halls in disassembled form. Daren selected the last large form from the list, a deep root, 160 sparks, a passage toward the hollow that the house dragged beneath the dead stream, 40 paces a night on the meagerest rations. The passage did not reach the hollow, nor was it meant to. It reached the black tower of the young house, the third cut. Daren was preparing himself. Knowledge had explained the transfer ritual without concealment, because the house had its own interest in this ritual and made no secret of it. The master enters the circle of another's house. The master opens his connection completely and utters his renunciation in parts. First from the forms, then from the sparks, finally from the first blood. After the third word, there is no turning back. There is a gap between the second and third words. Knowledge called it the width of 7 heartbeats. In this gap, both houses are wide open to one another, and the master's will still belongs to the master. Daren memorized the words of the ritual just as he had once memorized the sequence of stress tests, until it became second nature, so that within 7 heartbeats he would not think, but act The fourth cut, a farewell that was not called a farewell. The widow packed him a sack of bread for the journey, just as one would for a living person. Tana brought a map of the basin's interior, drawn from memory, showing rows of cells. Brax silently handed him his father's knife. In front of everyone, Morel checked his clearance calculation 3 times and, in front of everyone, said that if he was off by even a single beat, she would personally carry out the council's decision. Coming from her, it sounded like concern. On the 28th day, a calamity struck that no one had anticipated. A messenger from the Baron galloped up to the fort. Ulmer had vanished. The merchant had set out the day before with a caravan bound for the southern refugees, and the caravan was found empty, with no signs of a struggle. Darren stood there with the letter and felt a chill rising from his stomach. Ulmer knew the outer layer of the plan. Ulmer didn't know the details, but Ulmer knew the dates of the caravans, knew about the dismantled traps, and knew that Darren, for some reason, had been buying resin through him in quantities that couldn't be explained by the change. That might have been enough for a smart listener. And the old man was a smart listener. It was too late to change the plan. Darren could only adjust what depended on him. He relayed an order through the route to Cold to move the underground catapults toward the Black Tower a day early, and on the morning of the 29th, he walked out of the fort's gate alone, just as promised, on foot, with no weapons in plain sight, with his father's Brax knife tucked into his boot. The journey to the Hollow took 4 hours, and they were the loneliest 4 hours of his life. The forest was silent. No creatures showed themselves. At the rim of the basin, they were waiting for him. 12 bipeds in bone armor stood in a corridor, and Darren walked between them down the bone steps that hadn't been there on his previous visit. The Elder House was worse on the inside than on the outside. The walls breathed. Red rivers of light flowed across the vaults. And there was sound everywhere, a steady, multi-layered hum in which Darren did not immediately recognize the sound of breathing. Hundreds of breaths, rows of cells stretched off into the side galleries exactly as Tana had drawn them. Eyes stared at him from dark slits. The people didn't scream, they stared in silence, and that silence made him want to howl. The old man was waiting for him in the center, by the funnel, without a mask. His face was old and serene, and the eyes on that face seemed to exist separately. There was no triumph in them. There was a weariness so profound that for a moment Darren forgot why he had come. The old man spoke first. He said he was glad the boy had turned out to be smart. He said he remembered his brother and that Darren built just as his brother had, sparingly and precisely. Then he took a step closer and said quietly something Darren hadn't expected. He said he was envious. Darren asked, why? The old man raised his hand, and a wave of red light swept through the galleries. He said that 40 years meant almost nothing here. He said that he too had once thought he was providing for his family. That somewhere in his 20s, he stopped understanding where he ended, and the grain began. That the mask isn't for strangers. The mask is so he doesn't see his own face in the water. And that the deal he'd offered was the last thing he'd still do on his own. The house wants a second house, and he wants to sleep. Darren stood in the heart of a foreign fortress amid cells filled with living people, and realized that what he saw before him was not an enemy. He saw before him a warning that had aged for 40 years, and pity would be the most dangerous mistake right now, because behind the old man's eyes, within the red rivers of the walls, something that never tires was listening and waiting. He said he was ready to begin. They led him to the funnel. A veil of red light breathed in the pit like a hole lined with skin. The knowledge of the elder house bore down on him from all sides, heavy as water in the depths. It did not speak. It watched. Darren stood on the bony rim, threw open the connection to his fort wide as his own knowledge had taught him, and began to a series. He pronounced his renunciation of forms and felt how, far to the south, his walls became mere stone for a moment. The voice of the walls fell silent. He was left deaf. It was like going blind. He pronounced his renunciation of sparks, and the red veins of his home in his memory faded to gray. Everything he had accumulated over 7 moons drifted away from him like an untethered boat. The Elder House surged forward with its entire rumble. The greed of this movement was physical. And in the silence that followed before the third word, Darren began to count his heartbeats. The month was marked by dual preparations. Above ground, the fort was staging the handover and removal of property, while underground, arrow launchers were being forged and a deep root had reached the captured Black Tower, and the handover ritual included a gap of 7 heartbeats between the renunciation of Sparks and the renunciation of First Blood. On the eve of the deadline, Ulmer, who knew dangerously much about the upper part of the plan, disappeared, so Cold brought forward the underground operations by a day. Darren entered the pit and saw galleries of cells filled with living people and a weary old man without a mask who confessed that he had long since ceased to rule his house and wanted only an end to it all. The ritual began. Darren renounced the forms and the sparks. His connection to the fort was severed and 7 heartbeats remained until the point of no return. The first beat, the world narrowed to the bony rim of the crater and to the count. Darren stood with his head bowed as one who has surrendered, and with all his remaining will, he held onto a single thread, the first blood. The blood that lay dormant beneath the puppy's black veins, an hour and a half's walk from here. The ritual had laid him bare, and through this exposure, he now felt the old man's entire network as if it were his own skin. The basin, the channel to the north, the Black Tower at its end, and the deep root of his fort drawn up to it from below, right up against it. The second blow, above the basin, evening was gathering, and the Elder House began to draw the horde home. The old man was fulfilling his part of the bargain. Waves echoed from the valley and flowed toward the basin for the feast. The house wanted its new power to be accepted at a full table. Thousands of creatures filled the ridges and slopes. Everything was exactly as Darren had calculated 29 nights ago. The third blow. Far to the north, Cold watched the hourglass that Merrill had calibrated to the rhythm of Darren's heartbeat at rest. The sand ran out. Cold lowered his hand, and a deep root pierced the thin bone sole of the Black Tower from within. The fourth strike, Darren released the thread. The first blood did not awaken gradually. It exploded. 7 moons ago, he had dripped a single drop onto a grain of wheat, but now, through an open ritual, his entire will surged into it. The black veins on the distant tower burst along its entire height like old shoelaces. The pup screamed, and it was his thin voice again. The old man's channel trembled. The door opened. The 5th blow. The old man raised his head. His eyes widened, and in them Darren saw not rage. He saw understanding and something akin to delight. And then the walls of the pit roared because the house too had understood. Red rivers of light surged toward the funnel to forcibly shut down the ritual and force the third word into submission. The 6th blow. Outside on the slopes, Cold's underground flamethrowers struck, along with Brax's assault squads that had emerged from deep underground in the wake of the spearheads. Burning resin rained down into the thick of the huddled horde. The creatures began dying by the hundreds right at the walls of the Elder's house. And their death, brought about by the will of the fort's masters, flowed according to the law of the grain toward where the first blood had pointed. Through the open door, through the awakening pup, southward, into the blinded gray veins of the fort, which began to fill with light. The 7th blow. Darren did not utter the third word, he uttered another, the word of rupture that his own knowledge had taught him in exchange for the promise of a great war. The ritual burst. The recoil hurled him from the bone edge, and for a moment the world ceased to exist. He came to on the bone floor, his cheekbone throbbing with pain. Night hung over the hollow, and the night was ablaze. The Elder House roared through every wall. For the first time in 40 years, thousands were dying right on its doorstep, and not a single drop of that death fell to him. A feast was taking place in his house, but it was a stranger who was eating. The house unleashed a horde onto the slopes, onto Brax's detachments, and the creatures died even faster, which only widened the flow southward. The house tried to close the vortex and stop giving birth, but birth was its essence, and stopping tore it apart from within. The 40-year-old machine was stuck in a loop of its own hunger. Darren got down on his knees and saw the old man. He was standing by the vortex, staggering, and the red veins of the entire house now converged on him. The house was losing its power and was drawing it from its last source, from its master, from its first blood. The old man was burning from within and offered no resistance. He turned his charred face toward Darren and made his first human gesture in 40 years. He tossed his mask to him and said in a voice reduced to embers that the cells open from the walls, that the walls obey the one who has the blood of the grain within him, and that the boy must hurry, because when the house realizes it is dying, it will want to take its entire granary with it. Darren ran. He ran through the galleries, pressing his slashed palm against the bone locks, and the rows of cells opened behind him, one after another. He shouted to the people where to run, and the people ran. First on their hands and knees, then on their feet, then in a crowd. Men picked up other people's children. Someone carried the elderly on their backs. Tana had been right about everything. 1,500. No fewer. The exodus made its way up the bone steps, over the ridge, past Brax's positions, and the hunters covered the crowd with fire as it flowed toward the fort along the old road. And the house was dying a long and terrible death. It was collapsing in on itself. Clusters of towers were sinking inward. The crater flickered and gave birth to the last creatures, already ugly and premature, and they scattered in disarray. Darren was the last to reach the ridge, carrying a lame boy on his shoulder, and he turned around once. Below, in the red haze near the dying crater, stood a slender figure. The old man did not come out. The old man remained standing at the heart of what he had built, and the haze closed in over him without a sound. By dawn, the valley had fallen silent. Darren stood on the ridge among his people and felt through the walls' restored voice how far to the south his fort rumbled with power. That night's tide of death had raised his home to a height that ancient lore had once described as shrouded in mist. And then, from the south, news arrived via the chain of sentries that explained Ulmer's disappearance and turned the victory into a trap, the messenger reported. His voice breaking. Ulmer is alive. Ulmer is in the fort. He crawled to the gates at night, battered, and said that the beasts had captured him, but he had escaped. They let him in, and an hour after his arrival, pitch burst into flames from inside the fort near the main gates. The warehouses by the gates were burning, and in the light of the fire, the sentries saw that Ulmer was not alone at the gate mechanism. With him were 4 strangers dressed as southern caravanners, and the fort's gates were open from the inside. In the space of 7 heartbeats, the plan worked. Cold pierced the soul of the black tower with a deep root. Darren awakened the first blood, tore open the old man's channel, and cut short the ritual with a word of rupture, after which the death of the horde, drawn toward the basin, flowed through the liberated young house into the fort. The elder house, fixated on starvation, began to devour its own master and collapsed. Meanwhile, the dying old man gave Darren a mask and revealed that the cell locks obeyed the blood of the grain, thanks to which Darren let out about 1,500 captives. The basin is dead, but word has come that Ulmer turned out to be a traitor. He infiltrated the fort with 4 strangers, set the warehouses on fire, and opened the gates from the inside. For an hour and a half, Darren ran deeper than he had ever run before, and the voice of the walls pounded at him the entire way with details he didn't want to know. The gates are open. Resin is burning near the warehouses. Strangers are in the courtyard. Merhill is wounded. And the most baffling thing of all, the house is silent about the beasts. No horde ever entered through the open gates. There were only 5 strangers, including Ulmer. 5 people wouldn't open the fortress gates for the sake of 5 people. The answer came to Darren as he ran, and it was worse than any horde. The gates weren't opened for the beasts. The creatures were wiped out that night along with the pit. The gates were opened for people. He burst out of the basement into the courtyard in the thick of a brief and vicious battle. The garrison already had the strangers outnumbered. 2 caravan drivers lay dead. 2 were fighting back by the gate mechanism back to back, and fighting not like merchants but like trained soldiers. And by the burning warehouse stood Ulmer, not fighting at all. He was shouting. He was shouting at the garrison to come to their senses. That an army of the true ruler of these lands was approaching from the south. That Duke Malgrim had mobilized 3,000 spearmen as soon as his men reported that the monstrous threat in the valley had perished. That Baron Weiler was a penniless upstart, and that the hill with its bone walls was now the most valuable asset in the north, and wise men would surrender their property to the new owner right. That was what the vanished caravan was all about. Ulmer had not been taken prisoner. Ulmer had gone on a trading trip. He had watched the preparations for the entire month and realized from the tar and the caravans that what was being prepared was not a surrender but an attack on the basin, and he sold this intelligence to the highest bidder in the south, the one who paid more than the Baron. The Duke was waiting beyond the pass. The Duke wanted to take the valley without the old man, but with all the bone fortresses, and the 5 led the troops forward to seize the gates from within on the night when the garrison would be celebrating. They hadn't accounted for one thing. There was no one left to celebrate. The fort hadn't slept that night. It had been drawing a river of power from the basin and was on combat alert. The battle in the courtyard ended before Darren could reach Ulmer. 2 of the Duke's soldiers were taken alive. Ulmer saw Darren and froze. He crawled backward along a log in the storeroom and spoke quickly. He said he'd wanted what was best for everyone, that the Duke would come anyway, and it was better to greet him with goodwill, that he was a merchant, and a merchant must always think of tomorrow's customer. Darren stood over him and said nothing. For 7 moons, this man had been bringing him iron. For 7 moons, he had eaten at his table. The trial was brief, and was a trial, not a reprisal. By noon, the fort's council and elected representatives from among the residents had gathered in the courtyard. They listened to the captured soldiers. They listened to the sentries. They listened to Ulmer himself, who was still haggling even now, offering a ransom and information about the Duke's army. They took his information for free because the captured soldiers had told them the same thing. 3,000 spears, a supply train with siege provisions. The Duke would be at the southern ford in 2 days. It was not Darren who read the verdict. Ulvig read the sentence as the elder, according to the custom of the valley. For opening the gates to the enemy in wartime, custom knew but one price. Ulmer screamed until the very end. He was hanged on the gate tower that he had sold. Darren did not look. He stood with his back turned, gazing south, and counted 2 days. 3,000 spears against 400, capable to bear arms. By all accounts from that past life and this one, the task was impossible. And then he heard his knowledge. The house spoke of its own accord, without being asked, for the 2nd time ever. The voice of knowledge had changed overnight. A river of power from the basin had lifted the house across a threshold Darren hadn't known existed, and the voice no longer held either the hunger of a puppy or a flat, impersonal tone. The voice was calm and deep. The house said it had seen the death of its elder relative that night and understood why he had died. The elder relative had made the master a part of itself. The house said it chose otherwise. It wanted to remain a part of the master. The house asked permission to reveal its new form. And for the first time, Darren responded to the house as one would respond not to a tool, but to an ally. He gave his permission. Knowledge unfolded, a form that was simply called the Walls of Departure. That night, by the deep root and the river of power, the house learned the most important lesson. It could grow not only on its own hill. In a single night, it could extend itself along a bone ridge, following any line traced by the master's blood. Darren looked at the blueprint unfolding in his mind and began to laugh quietly and eerily. He realized what he would show the Duke. For 2 days, the fort had not been preparing for defense. The fort was preparing the road. Darren, riding with a slashed palm, rode from the southern ford along the old road through the gorge between the cliffs, and his blood dripped onto the rocks every 10 steps. Behind him came wagons carrying the carcasses of the last horde from the basin. They were piled along the road, in the gorge, like firewood. Marl positioned her men on the cliffs. Brax led the hunters to their ambush positions. The Baron brought everything he had and took up position with his cavalry beyond the gorge, out in the open, serving as both bait and a final deterrent. Duke Mulgrim entered the gorge on the morning of the third day. He marched confidently because his scouts had reported that the Bone Fortress was far away on the hill, while facing him in the field was the Baron's pitiful 100-strong force. When the head of the column entered the narrowest part of the gorge, Darren, standing on the rock, unclenched his fist, and his blood fell onto the stones of the path. The structure took shape. Walls rose from the ground along the line of blood before the eyes of 3,000 people. A bone ridge rose up in front of and behind the column, sealing off the pass from both ends. The house drank the corpses lining the road in one gulp to fuel its growth. And at the sight of hundreds of dead creatures melting into white bones, the Duke's soldiers began to experience what happens to anyone who witnesses such a sight. Arrows from the cliffs were hardly needed. Darren stepped out onto the crest of the new wall alone. He did not shout out terms. He simply stood there so that he could be seen, a man at whose word fortresses spring from the earth. The Duke proved to be no less of an accountant than the Baron. He stepped forward, looked at the walls, the cliffs, and his trapped army, and asked aloud what the Lord of the Valley wanted. Darren replied with 3 things. The army will withdraw beyond the pass. The Duke will sign, in the presence of his soldiers, a renunciation of all claims to the valley, and the Duke will take the merchant's body from the gate tower with him so that those in the south may know what happens to those who trade in gates. By evening, the gorge was empty. As Darren had ordered, the house lowered the exit walls back into the ground, leaving only 2 low ridges as a reminder and a warning. The Baron stood beside Darren on the cliff, watching the departing column, and said quietly that he now understood the old man in the mask. Darren asked what exactly. The Baron replied that with such power, the hardest thing would not be to win. The hardest thing would be to stop, and he rode off to his people. And Darren remained on the cliff with the old man's mask in his saddlebag, and with those words which carried more weight than 3,000 spears. The first night after the Duke's departure was the first night in 40 years for the valley when no one looked up at the sky in fear, and yet everyone looked up anyway. The moon rose at the appointed hour and was pale, not red, not pink, just a moon, the color of old silver. People stood on the walls of the fort, on the walls of Harlan, on the ashes of the southern shelters, and looked up in silence. Then, somewhere below in the courtyard, a widow began to weep, and as if on cue, the valley came alive with noise, shouts, and the crackling of bonfires until morning. That very night, knowledge explained the moon to Darren calmly and simply. The red color was a reflection. The beacon of the Elder House had been burning into the sky from the heart of the basin for 40 years with such intensity that the sky responded. Darren listened and thought about how, all these years, people had been hiding from their own reflection. Then came the work which lasted all fall and all winter. 1,500 people rescued from their cages had to be fed, clothed, and settled, and this proved more difficult than any wave. Darren set aside the top 2 tiers of the root tunnels for housing. The Baron opened the winter granaries. Ovig took in 400 people in Harlan and walked among the newcomers looking 10 years younger, because for the first time in his life, the refugee was growing rather than dwindling. Among those rescued were masons, blacksmiths, and 3 dozen who remembered the fallen refugees and wanted to rebuild them. In the spring, convoys of settlers set out from the fort in 3 directions, and with each convoy, Darren traveled part of the way, spilling blood onto the stones. By summer, 3 new settlements stood in the valley, and low bone ridges stretched along the roads between them, not walls, boundary markers. Signs that the land was under protection. The beasts still remained in the forests. The premature litter from the last night in the hollow had scattered into the thickets and gone feral. But these were already beasts, not waves. Brax's hunting packs hunted them as they hunted wolves, and the bones were turned into the forge of flesh. Brax also went into the dead basin, alone. Darren didn't ask why, and Brax didn't say. He returned 4 days later, silent. He brought a handful of earth from the ridge and buried it at the roots of the old oak beyond Harlan, where his father's stone stood. After that, for the first time in Darren's memory, he got drunk and sang. Darren decided not to leave the young house on the distant hill. Freed from the black veins, the pup reached out to him through the bond, subtly and questioningly, and waited for the command to grow. Darren rode up to the white tower, sat down at its base, and spoke to it aloud for a long time. In full view of the bewildered, cold garrison, he explained, as one would explain to a child, that 2 large houses in a single valley meant 40 years of the red moon, that he was proposing something else. The young house's consciousness pondered for 3 days. Then the tower began to shrink. The young house folded itself back, coil by coil, and on the 3rd morning, a bone seed the size of a fist lay on the hilltop, warm and sleeping. Darren took it to the fort and placed it in the deepest niche of the cellar, next to the old man's mask. Not a weapon, nor a supply. A reminder that from any seed grows whatever it is fed. Darren did not dissolve the fort council, but made it permanent, and as its first law, they recorded the agreement they had once whispered to one another. The council's right to stop the master at any cost if the master begins to change. Meryl demanded that a second line be added to the law. She measured change. The council judges not by the master's words, but by 3 things: whether the house is feeding anyone against their will, whether walls are growing where they were not asked for, and does the master remove his mask when spoken to. Marl wrote the last clause while looking Darren in the eyes, and Darren was the first to sign. Senta brought back a document from the Baron's castle declaring the hill and the lands around it to be freehold property, with a seat on the Valley Council. The Baron accompanied his signature with a single handwritten line. He wrote that for the first time he was investing in something he could not take away, and that this was the best investment of his life. Guffried came to collect trade duties, no longer wearing his black cloak. Tana remained at the fort, and by fall she took over the widow's underground kitchen, because the widow declared that she finally wanted to cook only for her own family. The tanner, with his ailing leg, died in his sleep that winter, well-fed and warm, and the entire fortress buried him. Cold married the daughter of the Harlan bellringer, and at the wedding, Darren learned that the young corporal who had once laughed at the empty man with the shovel now tells the children at the gate that he was the first to recognize the great builder in Darren. Darren listened and didn't argue. People needed such tales, but the truth was enough for him. The truth came to him at night when he went down to the basement and sat among the smooth red veins. The house no longer offered him great wars. The house had learned to ask how he was doing and to be silent alongside him. Sometimes Darren would take out the old man's mask and hold it in his hands. The mask was light and comfortable, and its inner surface had been worn to a shine by 40 years of a stranger's face. He looked at it and tested himself the way one tests a load-bearing beam. Did he want to put it on? Not yet. He knew he would have to keep testing himself for the rest of his life, and that for this he had the advice of Marel's knife and the eyes of the people who looked him in the face every day rather than at his walls. On the anniversary of that last red night, the valley gathered at the fort for the first harvest festival. A real harvest from fields that had been sown for the first time without regard for the moon. Tables stretched from the gate to the old entrance of the labyrinth that Darren had never managed to unravel, but had instead planted with hops. They drank to the fallen, to the saved, to the barren, to the foolish, brave master of the hill. Alveg spoke, and in his speech he admitted before everyone that he had been wrong 3 times. When he had judged Darren's father for his debts, when he had wanted to burn the hill, and when he had thought that walls were just logs. Walls, said the old man, are people who know why they stand. Late at night, as the bonfires were dying down, Darren climbed up to the tower alone. Below lay the valley, bathed in sparse, warm lights. To the east, a silver, serene moon hung over the ridge. He placed his palm on a bone and tooth battlement, warm as the flank of a living beast, and felt the house respond to his touch with its entire depth, from the lighthouse to its farthest roots. He remembered waking up here in the cold on a stranger's cot with unfamiliar hands, and thought that in all that past life spent among blueprints and concrete, he had never once built anything that would love him in return. Knowledge stirred beneath his palm, as quiet as a breath, and for the first time in 2 lifetimes, it asked not about sparks, not about forms, and not about enemies. It asked if the master was well. Darren gazed at the white moon above the peaceful valley and answered aloud with a single word. He said yes, and the house hummed contentedly beneath his hand, steady and deep like the hum of a hearth in a home where everyone is finally home. The red moon turned out to be a reflection of the basin's lighthouse, and with its death, the sky cleared, and over the course of a year, the valley returned to a peaceful life. The survivors were resettled. 3 settlements were rebuilt along the roads, marked by boundary ridges of bone from the remnants of the creatures. The creatures were reduced to game for hunting, and the young house voluntarily reassembled itself back into grain, which was stored in the cellar next to the old man's mask as a memento. The council enshrined the right and standards of the master's halt in law. The Baron recognized the hill as the free domain of fate. The fates of all the heroes were settled, and at the first harvest festival, Olveg acknowledged his mistakes. Darren, atop the tower under the white moon, hears a question about himself from the house for the first time and replies that he is well.